This is the first webinar in the new Webinar Wednesday series offered by the Public Service Alliance of Canada Prairie Region. On the second Wednesday of each month, we'll offer an interactive webinar as an outlet for members to learn about critical issues and get important updates. The webinars will also be an opportunity for members to ask questions and give feedback. Tonight's webinar will focus on how bargaining works and the process required to implement a collective agreement within federal jurisdiction. Our guest speaker tonight is Tom Milne. Tom is the regional negotiator for the PSAC Prairie Region. He has worked for the PSAC as a negotiator for 8 years and is responsible for more than 25 bargaining units, including regional employers and national units.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for taking part in this. Just a couple notes before I get into the content. What we wanted to do in this webinar is focus on the process itself, how it works, what the steps are. What we're going to try, it may be difficult, especially at this juncture, we're going to try to avoid getting into looking for updates on what's happening with specific units or specific rounds of bargaining that are taking place at the moment. That's something we could certainly do in the future, and there's processes for that within each group that's in bargaining right now. So what I wanted to do is sort of break the process up just into sort of 3 general topic areas. The first being the gathering of input, or soliciting members for their ideas for change in the collective agreement. The second piece will deal with the actual face-to-face bargaining and how that works and what that's like. And then the third piece is called deal or no deal, and I'll talk about what happens when an agreement is reached and what happens and what the process is when an agreement is not reached. So the first thing that happens, and I'm going to assume that we're dealing with a collective agreement that's already in place. The process for a first agreement is a little bit different. So we're going to, as an example, we're going to focus on an agreement that is up for renewal as opposed to a first agreement. So where the process begins is with what we call the input call. And that is a document that is sent from headquarters to component leadership. And it will be sent directly to a local in the case of a directly chartered local where there's not a component involved. That generally happens about 6 to 8 months prior to the expiry of the collective agreement, and so that notifies the component leadership that we're looking for that process to begin. That then gets passed down to the local that's involved, that's going to be involved in the bargaining. That document identifies who the negotiator is, and it also sets out timelines for the submission of proposals. So in that document there will always be, please have proposals submitted to your negotiator by X date. It's really helpful if that deadline is followed. However, most of our negotiators are not going to be averse to hearing submissions beyond that point. The next piece, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but a lot of our bargaining units have employees who may or may not be deemed essential during a lockout or a strike. That process, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. That is a webinar in and of itself. We have specialized staff who deal specifically with those agreements. So it's the negotiator's responsibility to let that individual know that an agreement's coming up. So I'll use a couple examples that I'm close to. The Royal Canadian Mint has a facility in Winnipeg and a facility in Ottawa. There's nobody in that bargaining unit that's deemed essential. A lot of the other units I deal with, in fact, I'm in Saskatoon tonight because we're bargaining with Saskatoon Airport tomorrow and Friday. Airports, by law, we can't shut them down during a strike. We can't make them non-operational. So airports, we would have a fairly large process around identifying who's essential, not necessarily who's essential, but what activities are essential. So that process takes place prior to bargaining as well. The next piece is what we refer to as bargaining conferences or local meetings. Our larger groups, a lot of the Treasury Board groups, and some of our larger units have a formal bargaining conference where delegates are elected from their locals and come to a conference to work on proposals. In a lot of the other groups, that's done at the local level. Either way, the purpose of that is to get members together well in advance, again, of the bargaining starting. And what happens at those conferences is, or those local meetings, is that the proposals or the input that has already been received from members is reviewed, it's prioritized, and there's a discussion held around those proposals and what they mean. It's essential that your negotiator be plugged into those conferences or those meetings, preferably in person, so that they get a flavor for what's happening in the workplace, particularly if it's a workplace that negotiator has not dealt with yet. The other function that happens at those meetings is the election of the bargaining team. Negotiators have zero role in that process. That is up to the local members and the components to elect, select, or otherwise put a bargaining team in place. Bargaining teams vary in size based on the number of members in the workplace. Some of our larger groups will have bargaining teams of 7 or 8, 9 members. Again, using airports as an example, as people know I like to do, most of our airports have bargaining teams of 3 members. Anyway, that process takes place either at a bargaining conference or at those local meetings. The next step is kind of a legal requirement, and that is the issuing of what's called the notice to bargain. That is a document that is sent to the employer, and depending on what legislation you're working under, there's timelines of when that needs to be sent. Normally it's 120 days or 4 months prior to expiry, and that is simply a document that gives the employer a heads up that we're looking forward to starting the bargaining process, and it identifies who the employer should be getting in touch with to start setting dates and that kind of stuff. Under most legislation, either party can serve notice to bargain. We generally find that it's us serving the notice. We're generally wanting to get to the table before the employer is. That's not always the case, but generally it's the union that notifies the employer first. So that's a document that's sent from our headquarters in Ottawa directly to the employer, basically to put them on notice that bargaining process needs to start soon. The next step is the establishment of what we call a strategy committee, which in the event of a strike would turn into a strike coordinating committee. That committee, and there's one for every round of negotiations, consists of the regional executive vice president, who's responsible for that bargaining unit. It is there's representation there from component leadership, from the negotiations section in Ottawa, which is who I work for. We have communications and research staff that are part of that committee, and we have also an individual who is the coordinator of mobilization, and that person's role is to help with mobilization in terms of, I'll get into more of that when the face-to-face bargaining starts. That committee ideally meets prior to the start of bargaining, just so everybody knows who's who in the zoo. Oh, I should also mention that committee must have at least one team member on it, and depending on the size of the group, there may be more than one team member. That committee's job is to keep the elected leadership informed of the status of bargaining, what's happening, what the issues are. That committee makes decisions regarding communications. What kind of communications are we going to have with members? Is it going to be leaflets or plant gates, that type of thing? And they also make decisions around strategy. What is the bargaining strategy going to be? Are we looking for a quick deal? Do we want a long process? Timing, that kind of thing. After that, the next step in the sort of first section of this webinar is the first, what I call the initial team meeting. So the team's been elected from the workplace, the negotiator is in place, proposals have been received, there's been a meeting to sort of vet those proposals that's open to the members, or a bargaining conference, as I mentioned. And so at that initial meeting, a number of things happen. It's good, particularly for people who haven't been on bargaining teams, to get familiarized with the process, to get to know their negotiator, maybe do some bonding if that's helpful. And also what happens there is, and I know I practice this consistently, is to share roles and expectations so that bargaining team members know what's expected of them, and they, team members, also can ask questions about what they should expect from the negotiator. And from that point forward, we want to function as a team, not a negotiator and 3 team members. We want to function as one group. So what role can members play in that input gathering process? The first step, I would say, in that is to have some knowledge of your collective agreement. Doesn't mean you need to know your collective agreement word for word. Some of our collective agreements are 40 or 50 pages long. Some of our collective agreements are hundreds and hundreds of pages long. It's not an expectation that every member knows every clause of the agreement, but to be familiar with it. During that input gathering initial process, it's good to talk to your coworkers about problems and concerns about what's been happening in the workplace since the last round of bargaining. You can also be someone who submits input, submits a proposal for change, and encourage your coworkers to do that also. I think everybody knows that not every single idea or proposal is going to succeed, but it's important for people to identify problems in the workplace so that we can take a crack at addressing them at the bargaining table. I mentioned earlier that one of the other things members can do that's very important when we're talking about essential service agreements and maintenance of activity agreements. Employers will put forward what they think are the activities that must remain in place during a strike or lockout. They generally want more of that stuff covered than we think is absolutely necessary. And our experts who deal with the employers on this, and I call them experts with all due respect, can't do their work without members having some input into. So if the employer says, for instance, we require 4 people all day long to perform this set of activities during a strike or lockout, we want members to be able to step forward and say, no, that's not true. They can do it with 2, or they can do it with 1, or they can do it with 3. So being involved, and generally what happens is local presidents and folks like that will contact members in those specific areas for their input. And finally, what role can you play in that process? Attend the local meetings. Attend the meeting where where proposals are discussed, where your team gets elected. Perhaps you'd like to submit your name to be on the bargaining team. So those are some of our ideas about what people can do in that stage of the process. So the next piece, and this is where the sort of action starts to really happen, is the face-to-face bargaining with the employer. So once the first stage is complete and the negotiator puts together package of proposals or demands that we're going to submit to the employer. Then it's also the negotiator's responsibility to make contact with the employer, establish dates of when the parties will meet to exchange proposals. So that the first meeting is, in most cases, not a lot of actual bargaining happens, but the parties get together to basically pass their proposals across the table to each other. And then the negotiator for each party will go through the proposal package, explain what changes the groups are looking for, and that's the first step in the process. Meetings with the employer like that can't always happen, should take place on what we call neutral ground, which means not at the regional office, not on the employer's premises. Generally, we use hotel meeting rooms in the vast majority of bargaining. There's some exceptions to that. We represent a lot of workers in the north where they don't have facilities. They may have one hotel in town, and they certainly don't have meeting rooms. So there are exceptions to that. There are times where we have had bargaining at regional offices or on the employer's premises, but only in exceptional circumstances where there's no other option. So once that takes place, it's very common for the parties. When I say the parties, I mean the union and the union team and the employer team, to focus on what we call non-monetary issues first, or issues that don't deal with money. So that would be issues around the grievance procedure, for example, or how leave is administered. The reason for that is that those non-monetary issues are very, very important to people. Yes, everybody's focused on the big issues like wages, pensions, benefits, all that stuff. But if you don't make a very, very concerted effort to deal with what I call workplace issues, and again, things around the grievance procedure, how leave is granted, those types of things that can be very irritating for members. Employers would like to just skip all that stuff and get to the money stuff at the end. If you fall into that trap, what happens is when you start getting into the big ticket items, even the union team, and I've seen it happen many times, those sort of non-monetary issues start to take on less importance, and the employers are very good at saying, you know what, let's just leave all that stuff the way it is, and let's try and get a deal here. So it's very important, I think, to try and deal with those sort of language issues first. So after that initial exchange of proposals, sometimes that's it for that round, depending on the employer and the size of the workplace. Sometimes you may exchange on Monday and then meet again Tuesday and Wednesday. Sometimes that makes sense. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes both parties need time to go away and look at what the other side has proposed. In any event, what happens from that point is the real sort of negotiation, bargaining in earnest, where we look at their proposals and we respond to them and say, no, we don't agree with that change, or yes, we can agree with that change because it doesn't harm us in any way. They'll do the same thing with our proposals. They'll respond and say, well, we don't want to do this, we don't want to do that. The initial first couple days of bargaining can be really challenged because both parties just keep saying no to each other on everything. But that ice eventually breaks, and then the union's bargaining team may look at the proposals and say, well, okay, well, there's certain things we don't have to get this round, so we may withdraw a proposal. We may say to the employer, we'll withdraw this proposal if you withdraw your proposal on this and leave everything the same. We may counter a proposal of theirs with something different. That's the back and forth of bargaining. Once those sort of non-monetary issues are dealt with, then we get into wage packages, benefit packages, those kind of things. A lot of times members, through that input process and through the local meetings we have with them, will identify their priorities. Sometimes they'll say, well, our wages aren't that bad, they're pretty comparable to other places, but our benefits are really falling short, so let's focus on that. Now, those priorities are things you need to know when you go in. What's interesting is a lot of people, especially the first time they're on a bargaining team, they have this impression that they're going to spend almost all of their time sitting across from the employer. And that's not the case. You spend a lot of time doing that, but a good chunk of your time is spent caucusing amongst yourselves, going through the employer's issues, going through our issues. What do we need out of this agreement? Separating wants from needs, all that kind of stuff. The important thing I've learned in that process is to not get into a habit of what's called bargaining with yourselves, where you start, saying, well, we could settle for this or we could settle for that. You really want to keep focused on your priorities and be careful about timing and what your strategy is and when you're going to start moving on certain issues. Near the end of each round, and a round would be a session. So, for instance, I mentioned earlier that we're meeting with Saskatoon Airport. This is our second round with them. So we met for a few days in late November, and we're meeting for a couple of days this week. So that would be considered a round. A round can be 1 day, it could be 3 days, but a session of days. Near the end of each one of those rounds, the union's bargaining team starts to have discussions about communication. What are we going to say to the members about this round? What kind of information can we provide in terms of updates? Should we be having an update meeting where the bargaining team and the negotiator have a meeting where members can come and get an update on what's been going on? So that is part of that process also. And depending on the number of issues that each party brings forward, typically most of the bargaining that I've been involved with takes 2, 3, 4, 2's probably short, 3 to 4, sometimes 5 rounds of bargaining. I can tell you, speaking for all of us who negotiate for this union and for others, the negotiation process is starting to take longer than it has in the past, and particularly at the federal level, because employers are feeling quite empowered, having their conservative friends in power in Ottawa, and they've seen that and feel that this is a very opportune time for them to try and take things away from us and reduce our rights and our power in the workplace. When that happens, it makes the process last longer because we spend more time pushing back that type of concessionary stuff. And so I don't want to sort of walk into the next session, but that process continues until an agreement is reached or an agreement is not reached, and I'll deal with that sort of deal or no deal contemplation in the next section. So when we talk about the face-to-face bargaining process, what can you do? What can members do? What can activists do to assist in that process? Assisting with communications. So if the bargaining team and the strategy committee think it's a good idea to put a leaflet together and we're going to put it on a website, or we're going to post it in the workplace, or, as we've been doing a lot of lately on the 19th of months, do plant gates or desk drops. It's very, very helpful if members assist in that process. I'll give you an example. I'll use the Royal Canadian Mint again. On December 19th, we did an information picket there. Of course, I was there. One of our regional reps was there. The local president was there, and the bargaining team members were there. The sort of likely suspects that members would expect to see, and that's all good. We all need to be there. But we also had several members, when we put the posting up announcing that we were going to have this plan gate, several members said, hey, can I come up, can I show up early and help? Absolutely. Because when members who don't pay a lot of attention to what's going on with their union, and let's be honest, there are folks like that, when they walk into their workplace and they see not just the typical union folks, but their co-workers handing out leaflets, talking to them about the issues that are happening at bargaining, and that's exactly what we did in Winnipeg at the Mint on the 19th. The feedback we got from the local was really, really positive. And one of the things a lot of members said was it wasn't just the union officials out there. There was a lot of members out there too. So that's really important. The other thing there's a couple other things. One of them that members can do during the process is keep an eye on the employer in the workplace. Not in any way that's going to get you in any trouble, but are managers behaving differently? Are they pushing harder on certain issues? Are they backing off on certain issues? Or are they just carrying on business as usual? Are managers talking about bargaining? Are they talking about issues in the workplace? Some of that kind of stuff they're not supposed to do. So keeping your eyes and ears open and letting your team members in the workplace know what you're seeing and what you're hearing. That's very important. The last suggestion I have on what you can do to help there, and this really is a piece that should be enforced after each section. It's very important to trust and support your bargaining team during this process. Being on a bargaining team, I think, is a wonderful experience. At the end of the day, you learn a lot, but it can be very stressful. You're going to have, you're going to go back in the workplace, and members are going to want to know specifics about what happened on this issue, what happened on that issue. It's not always in our interest to get into that much detail about what's happening during the process. But trusting and supporting your bargaining team is so important. And I say trust because these people were elected, or they were put on the bargaining team for a reason, and you need to trust them. And you'll have an opportunity to judge their work. But nothing makes a bargaining team feel better than, or team members feel better than when they go back into the workplace or they do an information picket like I talked about earlier, and folks say, hey, keep at it, hang in there. That makes a huge, huge difference. So trusting and supporting your bargaining team throughout the process is absolutely critical. Okay, I will stop and see if there's any questions on that piece.
Hi there. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay,
I
I was just wondering about the aspect of, when the bargaining round is done, each session is done, and you go back into the workplace and stuff. When the team members are meeting before they depart, is it wise to set up guidelines as to how much to share with the members when you go back, and certain, I don't know, words to use and whatever, like along, the gist of my questioning here.
Yes, it's very important, and I think I touched on that a bit. But when the team is getting near to the end of the round, they need to talk about they need to have a good discussion about what form the communication is going to take. And I should say forms now, because we don't just do one thing. We can do paper, we can do digital, we can. But yes, it's a tricky thing, because on the one hand, members have a right to know what's going on. On the other hand, is it helpful to the process, to give people a play-by-play of everything the employer said, every issue that's been brought up. We never want to be accused of hiding anything, but yes, it's important for the team to all be on the same page about what we're going to talk about and what we're not going to talk about. And again, that goes back to the the whole concept of trusting your bargaining team. It's a pretty fine line to walk, you know, particularly for newer team members, because they may not know. I mean, we negotiators tell them, but they may not be prepared for the for the kind of questions that they're going to get when they get back to the workplace. So absolutely, you know, there's a couple things to keep in mind there. You want people to be informed in general about what's going on. We're getting closer to a deal. We're not getting close to the deal. Employers putting forward lots of concessions, or they're not. But what you have to be careful of is there's, I don't want to get too lawyer-like here, but there are concepts in labor laws. One of the things that can happen if you share too much information, if you go into the workplace and put out communications that talk specifically about issues and you try to bargain them through the workplace, you can be charged by the employer with what's called bargaining in bad faith, because the law, trying to do this quickly, the law contemplates that both parties are obligated to try and reach a settlement, and no party is allowed to put up impediments to that process. By impediments, I mean unnecessary stalling, not agreeing to meet on a timely basis, and bargaining through the workplace. So we have to be careful of that, and like I said, it's a fine line to walk. I'll give you an example. I was involved in a round of bargaining with a group of firefighters at one of our airports in the prairies. They had a very contentious issue on the table that had to do with scheduling. And the fire chief got a lot of the firefighters together, and this idiot was actually on the team, so he should have known better. He was on the employer's team. Got the employees together and said, look, the union, meaning myself and the RVP, the union is giving us a really hard time on this thing, and I think you guys need to talk to them. All we're trying to do here, blah, 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 blah. That's bargaining in bad faith. In that particular case, we gave the employer a courtesy and said, make it stop, shut this guy up, to be frank. If he does it again, we're gonna file charges. That goes to the board. That's a whole other process. It is a fine line to walk. But back to your original question, Karen, yes, that discussion at the end of each round is very, very important. What are we going to share? What do we need? What could happen if we share too much? How does that fit into our strategy at this stage of the game? Thanks.
Okay, so I belong to Table 1, and I don't think that anyone on that particular bargaining team are actually from my location. So you suggested that we support our bargaining team. How would you suggest that I support my bargaining team when I don't have any direct contact with them? I can't, say good job,
sure,
or we're behind you. What would you suggest?
That's a great question. I have a suggestion that I've seen before. First of all, those larger units, and that's the PA group I believe you're talking about. They have through the website, they have the ability to provide comments and feedback, and so it's very quick and fairly easy to say thanks for your hard work. And I know it's not a face-to-face, it's not a pat on the back, but it helps. The other thing people can do, so if you're in a local, in a big group like a Table 1 group or PA group or Parks or even the Mint, and you don't have a team member close to you, and Parks is a great example of that because they're so spread out across the country. I'll give an example because I'm the negotiator for Parks and the Parks group this time. Before our last round of bargaining in early December, I believe, and I don't want to get this wrong, but I believe it was the Newfoundland Area Council took a PSAC poster, a blank poster that just said PSA at the top. So it's probably a poster that we would use in an information picket that we can put anything we want. They all signed it. it was like a birthday card that people pass around at work. You know, good luck, go get them, you know, that kind of stuff. They all the members of that council signed it, put it in a big envelope, and sent it to me. In fact, it was so big that Sister Marianne had to use one of her larger suitcases to put it in because it wouldn't fit in mine. So when we got to the bargaining session, I didn't mention this to the team right away. I just put the poster up on the wall behind our side so that the employer could see it too. And then at some point during our meeting before the employer came in the room, I said, oh, by the way, folks, we've got a message of support up here on the wall. And they all got up and looked at it. It made people feel really good. So there are ways that that you can do that. If none of those, if that doesn't work for you, you can send a message of support directly by email to the regional office, the PSA regional office that's closest to you, and that I guarantee you will get to the team members. You can send an email or a message to your component president, or you can contact your REVP directly. I understand that in the next few months the REVPs for PSAC are going to be doing some touring and doing some meetings of that nature. That's another place where you could do that. But that's a great question.
And just to follow up on that, Tom, a couple more ways to reach your bargaining team and send your messages. You can always tweet a message of support, and if you mention our Twitter, which is at PSAC Prairies, in your message, we'll be sure to retweet those. You can also go on the PSAC Prairie's Facebook page, which is Public Service Alliance of Canada Prairie Region. It's spelled out in full. Go on that page and post a message of support on the page as well. Also, we're going to talk about this or touch on this a little later as well, but just to, since it's so applicable right now, we also recently put up a video where members were sharing their messages of support on video. So we shared this video, we tweeted it out, we sent it to the bargaining team, and posted on Facebook, and one of the bargaining team members actually commented on it and said, as a member of the FB bargaining team, thank you. So this stuff is definitely seen, and it's appreciated, and there's many ways to get your message out.
Okay, thanks, Jeffrey. So this last piece, I'll briefly go over what happens if an agreement is reached through the normal bargaining process with face-to-face meetings with the employer. Once an agreement is reached, the negotiator, some employers do it, volunteer to do it. My practice is to do it ourselves, is to create a memorandum of settlement. That's a document that lays out what the parties have agreed to in the round of bargaining. So it's a document, it's not the entire collective agreement, it's a document that says, here's what both parties have agreed to in terms of this agreement. The negotiator is responsible to create a ratification package, or we call it a ratification kit. That's the document that you get when you go to the meeting that has all the changes laid out in it. It's also the negotiator's responsibility to work with the bargaining team to set a ratification date. Ideally, you want that to be, fairly soon after the agreement is reached. So a meeting takes place, the negotiator is there to explain the agreement, allow people to ask questions about those changes, and then a vote takes place. And if the majority of members support the new agreement, then the negotiator's responsibility continues in terms of creating a new collective agreement with the new changes in it, and arranging for the signing of that agreement. There used to be a day, apparently, and I know a lot of unions used to do this, where they'd get all the parties together and they'd have this signing ceremony. Not really my thing, but and to save time and money, what we do now is we just ship or courier the new agreements around for all the parties to sign. Those original signed copies of the agreement, one needs to be filed with the applicable labor board. So the negotiator is responsible for sort of coordinating all that. The negotiator is also responsible for any follow-up that comes out of the new agreement. And what I mean by that is if there's a new initiative put place in the agreement, whatever that may be, the negotiator needs to stay on top of things and make sure that that happens. If there is language that's negotiated that's time sensitive, if you negotiate a letter of understanding that says within 90 days the parties will meet to discuss whatever, it's the negotiator's responsibility to make sure that happens. What I'm getting at there is it's not appropriate for a negotiator to say, okay, you know, got the deal signed, got it delivered, everybody's got their copies. We'll see you next time. There's a role to play from the negotiator between rounds 2, and just in terms of providing support and making sure that anything that's time sensitive is dealt with. What role can you play when an agreement is reached? You want to ensure that you're familiar with those changes and what amendments have been made to the collective agreement. And most importantly, you want to ensure that the employer abides by those changes. So, for instance, if you've negotiated language that says when you apply for vacation leave or annual leave, the employer, let's say the old language said that they had 20 days to get back to you. And you've changed the language to say now they have to get back to you within 10 days. Some employers are better at this than others. Some employers, when the deal is done, they actually get all their managers together and say, okay, here's how the rules have changed. A lot of employers don't. So we can negotiate whatever we want. If we don't have folks out there making sure that this stuff's being enforced, then it's all for naught. A lot of managers say, oh, I didn't know about that change. Well, you know what? It's there, and they need to abide by it. So members can assist in that as well. Now the fun part. No deal. Again, we're sort of trying to focus on units that fall under federal legislation. Each province has their own legislation, and depending on what kind of workplace you have and where you are will determine what legislation you fall under. But generally what happens is you have your face-to-face meetings to the employer, and you get to a point where there's not a deal to be had here. We're too far away, whether it's on wages, benefits, or non-monetary issues. Then what happens is one negotiator, usually I'll do it if I know it's going to happen, we'll say to the employer, look, we've reached impasse. And impasse is the legal term that says, we're not going to be able to come to an agreement here. When that happens, a number of things need to happen in terms of member communication, but I'm going to sort of focus on sort of what the not too much legalese, but what that process is. So what happens when you reach impasse or where you can't come to an agreement is, and again, this is one of those things that either the union or the employer can do, but we always make sure that we do it. We file what's called a notice of dispute with the applicable labor board. So in a lot of cases, that'll be the Canadian Industrial Labor Relations Board or the PSLRA board, depending on the bargaining unit. So basically, that's a notice to the appropriate government body that there's a dispute here that can't be resolved through the traditional bargaining process. Sometime in there, and that, the strategy, going back to the strategy committee, they'll decide when it makes sense to do this. When that happens, it's a good idea and a necessary step for the local or the bargaining unit to take a strike vote. That is a specific meeting designated just for that purpose. The negotiator and the bargaining team are there to explain to members what the outstanding issues are, and members then can vote on whether they support the bargaining team and the union as a whole taking strike action. The reason you generally want to do that at that point is because it sends a message to the employer that the members are serious. Now, once you file that notice of dispute, there are a lot of timelines around that. That's again, that's a webinar unto itself. Generally, within 15 or 20 days, the government, whichever government you're dealing with, has to appoint a conciliator or a mediator, someone who's skilled in trying to get parties together. So the conciliator will, once they're appointed, will contact both negotiators for the employer and the union, set up dates to get together. What happens in that process? Now, that conciliator has no power to impose. They're not like an arbitrator. That's a different process. I'll talk about that briefly in a second. But in a bargaining unit that has the right to strike, or the employer has the right to lock out, they will appoint, as I said, a conciliator who will try to get the parties together, and I don't necessarily mean physically together. Generally, by that point, once you've reached impasse, both teams really aren't super interested in spending a whole bunch of more time together. Right? It's not always that acrimonious, but it can be. So generally, what happens is the conciliator will set meeting dates. They'll book meeting space at a hotel, and the union will be in one room, and the employer will be in another room, and the conciliator will have a meeting room of her own or his own. They'll get the parties together initially just to give a quick update on what the outstanding issues are, and then the conciliator's job is to go back and forth between the two groups and say, well, would you go for this? Would you go for that? And try to push. Honestly, a good conciliator will annoy and upset both parties. If a good conciliator, in my view, is doing their job, they will push. They'll go into the union room and they'll push and say and try to push you to where they think the deal is, and they'll do this. A good conciliator will behave the same way with the employer. Some conciliators are better at that than others, but their job then is to try to mediate a settlement. If that doesn't work, and the union has their strike vote in place, then again, depending on legislation, the union may decide to serve notice. I'll use the Canada Labour Code as an example. That has a 72-hour notice requirement. So you serve that on the employer saying, in 72 hours, we're going on strike. Interesting enough, sometimes when you do that, the employer may take a second look and say, oh, geez, and sometimes they come back with another offer. It's not something you bank on, but it happens. And if that doesn't work, then a strike takes place, and what happens during a strike, again, is another webinar unto itself, but that strike will last until a settlement is reached. I'll quickly talk about, and I don't know how many folks this applies to on this particular session. I mentioned earlier dealing with airport firefighters. They have no right to strike at all. They are all deemed essential, no different than city firefighters or city police departments. So when you reach impasse with those types of bargaining units, because they don't have the right to strike, yes, there's a conciliation process, like I just outlined, and if that doesn't work, then the parties go to what's called binding arbitration, where both sides agree on an arbitrator or an arbitration panel, and the parties get together, and that can be a little more formal, a little bit more court-like. There's a little more rules around that and evidence and all that stuff. But then both parties present their outstanding issues, present their case, and then that arbitration panel goes away, and sometimes they're pretty quick, sometimes they're not, but they will come back and they will issue an award, as it's called, and they will, in that award will be a decision on every single outstanding item that they heard. So they may agree with the union and say, yeah, the union gets, the union succeeds on this piece, or they may say, no, the employer succeeds on this piece. That's a complicated process, requires a lot of work. When you're talking about wages, the union can't just go in there and say, we deserve 5% because we deserve it. You need to back that up with evidence, what's happened with other agreements. It's a bit more of a legal process. But again, in those situations, it's going to be, your contract dispute's going to be decided by a third party. What role can you play when an agreement is not reached? Certainly, it's very, very important. This is a big, big deal to attend the strike vote meeting. Obviously, if the union's recommending that you support them, it's helpful that you do that. But there's a couple things you don't want to come out of a strike vote. One is where you get a very, very strong strike mandate. 98% of the members in attendance support the union taking strike activity. And let's say that bargaining unit has 200 people in it, but only 60 of them showed up. That's a problem. Because you can bet dollars to donuts that the employer is going to find out somehow that there was only 60 people at that meeting out of 200, and they're not going to take that strike vote. I mean, it's a legally binding strike vote. I mean, that part's okay. But remember, employers and the media, they don't really, I mean, they're interested in what the percentage is in terms of support for a strike, but they're much more interested in, well, how many members actually showed up, right? So it's very important to attend a strike vote meeting. When we think a strike might be happening, the strategy committee, it's the same people, but they turn into a strike coordinating committee. They will start to engage with our regional officers and our regional representatives to start doing strike preparation training, some courses on strikes and what you can do and what you can't do, putting a strike infrastructure in place, which is picket captains, strike captains, volunteers to help with all of the activities that go around the strike. That's actually a good mobilization tool. When the employer knows that we're getting ready for a strike, when they know we're having meetings and training people, that can also push them towards maybe putting a better offer forward before that actually takes place. And then, in the event that a strike or lockout actually happens, yeah, take a leadership role if you want to. If you that's something that members can do. Volunteer to be a strike captain. Or whatever's necessary. And as I mentioned before, just as a wrap up on this, that process does vary depending on what legislation you're working under. So it's the negotiators' responsibility, along with our research staff and our legal staff, to make sure that we don't miss any timelines. But as I said, there is some variance to that, but the general process is that there is a notice of dispute, a conciliator tries to get the parties together, and if that doesn't work, then there's either a work stoppage, either a lockout or a strike. Okay, questions?
Okay, so I see a question from Sheila, a question in chat that says, does anyone monitor the conciliator during that process?
They spend a lot of time privately with each party, so it's difficult to sort of monitor what they're saying to the other party. Like, we don't know. So if the conciliator comes and sees us in our room and has a discussion with us about a particular issue and says, well, okay, I'll go back and talk to the employer, we have no idea what that conciliator is saying in the other room. But the employer doesn't. It's the same thing for them. They don't know what the conciliator is saying in our room. I've never really felt a need to sort of monitor them in that sense. An important thing, most conciliators, in fact, I think almost all of them, are former negotiators of some kind or other. I know some former union negotiators that are now conciliators. I know some former employer negotiators who are now conciliators. We make sure we check them out. We know most of them by now. Over time you get to know them. They're the same people, so you know their strengths, you know their weaknesses. Some conciliators are really, really good, and I tell you, the ones that are good are the ones that upset you, because they're pushing. Sometimes But you can't tell. I've had employers talk to me afterwards and say, "Oh, that conciliator, well, I didn't like him. He pushed us. He pushed." I don't know if they're telling me the truth, and I don't trust them. It's not in our interest to trust them or distrust them. But we certainly don't monitor their activity, or how long they're spending here or how long they're spending there. One of the other things conciliators really like to do, if they think they're getting close to a deal, they'll come in the room, and this is an important part of the process too, both before conciliation and after. They'll come into the room and they'll say, "Okay, Tom, I want to see you, and I want to see the employer's negotiator out in the hallway." It's called the sidebar, or the deal in the hallway. My policy, and most negotiators follow this, that's not the way we generally do business. Our business is to be conducted in front of everybody, so that everything is transparent. But sometimes what happens is the conciliator will want to talk to both lead negotiators alone, and try to sell a deal to both of them, to then try to go back and sell to their respective teams. What I do, and what a lot of negotiators do in that situation, is say, "Okay, well, I'll go out in the hallway with you, but I'm bringing a team member with me." Or if I'm working with a component that has a RVP, at the table, UCTE has that practice, then I bring somebody with me. I don't do it alone. It may help you get to a deal, but I don't think it builds any trust, because now I'm going back into the union team saying, "Okay, folks, well, how about this? Or how about that?" Well, now I'm a conciliator. So you got to watch you don't fall into that trap. Strayed a little bit from your question, Sheila. But there's no formal process to monitor what the conciliator is doing. We certainly try to, we keep an eye on them, but if they're mediators and conciliators that we've dealt with before, and that we may not like them, but we trust them. We know that they try to do a good job. They're not, lazy people who just try and get it on as quickly as they can. There's not too many of those ones left. I hope that somewhat answers your question, but there's no formal monitoring process. But we try to keep an eye on them.
So, in response to what can you do to support, that one little thing means an absolute difference. So, you know what? Go on the website, check out the video, post it to your Facebook. All of this stuff can be shared in any medium you want. So after today, this was the first in a series. We have 5 more webinars scheduled. It will be Webinar Wednesday. And, we're hoping for the snowflake model where one person, you bring someone else with you next month. Next month's webinar is on the retirement revolution. We know that this government is out to attack pensions and create 2-tiered pension plans. So we'll have some experts giving information on what that means to you. March will be on childcare. April is about let's get political. And May is a little bit of labor history, just, to put it in context when you're having that discussion with a coworker who said, unions aren't needed anymore, or, the union didn't give us this, the employer did. So we'll give you a little bit of labor history, and June is on health and safety. So Tom kind of mentioned it. I just want to mention one thing. Hopefully you're hearing some things about activities around the 19th of every month. And, PSAC members coast to coast to coast have been for the last few months voluntarily and kind of randomly doing activities on the 19th of every month in support of bargaining and their bargaining teams. So why did we pick the 19th? Well, the next federal election is scheduled for October 19th, 2015. So this is about working together to send a message to this government that as union members, we're not going to be bullied, we're not going to be threatened into giving up anything like sick leave at the table, we're not giving up any concessions. be it Treasury Board, be it CFIA, Parks, Canada Revenue, airports, any unit where PSAC members are, we're saying to employers, we're done. We will not accept concessions. So we're asking members to be creative. We're asking members to do an event on the 19th of every month, and maybe for 19 minutes. So, do a walk through the building, put a doctor's mask on if sick leave is the issue in your building for 19 minutes. Do an information picket. Talk with locals in your building if there's other components. If there's other unions, we can work with PIPs and other unions. Let's be creative, and there's a poster on the screen right now that you can get off the website that you can distribute with some ideas. You can send letters, you can wear buttons or bracelets. The regional office can help you with some supplies and some ideas, and make sure to send in any pictures and reports to the regional office. Because employers do recognize that we are mobilizing. The government recognizes that we're mobilizing. So the more that we can show solidarity for the bargaining teams, the better. And if you're not a federal government worker, sick leave isn't on the table for you. The reality is, as Tom said, when you support another unit, they will be there to support you. So this initiative is not just for Treasury Board, it's not just for federal workers, it's for everyone, because regardless of who you are, we intend on standing beside each other on the picket lines or at the bargaining table and at rallies. So, I want to really thank Tom for taking an evening right before going to the bargaining table tomorrow. And Jeffrey also for working through the new technology. We really look forward to your feedback. I think you're going to get a survey by email after. We really appreciate if you take the time to fill it out. And, when it gets posted to the website, share it out with members. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good evening.